They're still making a lot of decisions based on instinct. In those sorts of situations, it can be really easy for anecdotes or input from a small group of really vocal people to have an outsized impact on decision making for an organization. What you may be hearing most loudly may not actually be what's driving the outcomes that you are seeing or hoping to see.
Welcome to What Works, where nonprofit leaders share real stories about what makes impact possible while building teams that thrive. I'm your host, Marla Moody, a transformational leadership coach, an author, and someone who has spent 3 decades in the nonprofit sector, watching brilliant leaders burn out because of doing too much, so much passion, too much infrastructure, and not enough self care. My guest today started her career sitting in the family living room in Detroit, interviewing teenagers and their parents for her PhD research on brain development, early trauma, and what happens to young people as they cross into adulthood. But today we're going to talk about something interesting, which is data. We want to analyze, we need to analyze, but the question is, who's the data for and who does it help? And I guarantee you, Tyler is going to be excited to talk about this. So, Tyler, welcome to What Works.
Thank you so much for having me, Marla. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I love, which is data.
You just mentioned how things got started. Let's even start there. Why did you take the work and energy to get a PhD?
That's a great question. So, my entire life, I was convinced I was going to be a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, like a 10-year-old interested in being a psychiatrist. And so I went into undergraduate, majoring in neuroscience, convinced I was going to go on to a career of medical practice. And there was a special fellowship that was offered at my college, University of Pittsburgh, where I was really focused on the translation of science into clinical practice and how that work happens. And so they placed undergraduate students 20 hours a week-ish in research labs affiliated with University of Pittsburgh Medical Center psychiatry labs, doing research ranging from like the very technical, like transmission across different synapses, all the way up through neuroimaging, which is the work that I did. And then the other half of the time, the same students were shadowing psychiatric clinicians. So I had the privilege of shadowing psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists, both in residential treatment facilities as well as community treatment teams. Really, through that experience, I found myself more interested in understanding how research could be leveraged to improve outcomes for folks experiencing mental health challenges and less interested in the clinical practice itself. I ended up coming away from that experience with an interest in mental health research that ultimately led to me pursuing a PhD at the University of Michigan. I started that PhD intending to study um, brain development, particularly among youth that had experienced early trauma, abuse, neglect, and how that would relate to anxiety and depression, particularly as they were transitioning into late adolescence or early adulthood.
At the beginning, I was like, how on earth do you go from, the neuro
Mm.
development to really just loving the data?
Mhm.
And so you explained it a little bit, but what was the shift for you that said, this is really where my passion is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of continuing along that trajectory in graduate school, um, I collected data with families directly. So, the study that I was working on sampled families from Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago, and I would go into their homes and interview them about their experiences. And then we would all go together to campus for neuroimaging, which is why I was originally involved, clinical interviewing, a whole day of different research activities. And then I would drive the families home at night. So I spent like a full day with families. adolescents and their caregivers. And during that time, I heard over and over again the ways in which families were interacting with policies and programs that were intended to benefit them. And sometimes they were totally transformative experiences. And sometimes the experiences didn't have the intended impact or potentially even harmful. And so that experience really got me interested um, in wanting to understand who are programs working for, who are they not working
Yeah.
for, what's underlying that, why is a program not having the impact it was intended to, and using the research skills that I had as someone who had gone through a PhD program, really leveraging that in order to help organizations achieve the most impact possible for the communities they seek to serve.
What is it about having good data that makes that difference?
So I would say that organizations are typically looking to use data to demonstrate their impact or report on their outputs, the number of people they trained, the change in student anxiety that students who participated in their programming experienced. And they're reporting on that impact back to the communities they served, ideally, hopefully, to the funders that have provided funding for them to do that work. And then also trying to leverage that to get additional funding to continue doing their work is typically sort of the main uses of data. I also really advocate for it being used as a continuous improvement tool, right? So, continuous monitoring of the data that you're collecting. Are you seeing what you would expect? If not, that signals that there's something to unpack, right? So maybe a program is not landing the way that you had hoped it would. That may be time to do some further investigation to understand what's happening there. High quality data, data that you can trust, removes second guessing and allows an organization to really efficiently make decisions and then act on the decisions that they've made. I personally advocate for a blending of data sources wherever possible. So, is there administrative data that you're already collecting, to sort of records that your organization has? Can that be combined with your website analytics? Maybe a couple of surveys of folks who are receiving your programming, focus groups when you need that deep dive, like I was talking about, something's not landing right, trying to figure that out. All of these approaches have their limitations, and they all place different burdens on your program recipients and also your staff. It's really important to diversify your data inputs, not only to increase the confidence, what you're seeing is showing up consistently across these different ways of getting signal about your programming, but also in order to really be mindful about the burden being placed on the communities you're serving. Fatigue is so real.
It's so needed, and I don't think sometimes people realize how hard it can be to get good data.
Extremely difficult, to get good data.
Where do you see someone who they thinks they're getting good data, they think they're getting all they need, but they're
Mhm.
really not, it's being missed? Like, how would you what would you talk about with that?
It's not uncommon for organizations to collect a lot of information, but for various reasons, maybe they don't have the analytic capacity, maybe what they've changed or collected has changed, rapidly over time. They're not making great analytic and decision-making use of that data, so they're still making a lot of decisions based on instinct. So in those sorts of situations, it can be really easy for anecdotes or input from a small group of really vocal people to have an outsized impact on decision-making for an organization. What you may be hearing most loudly may not actually be what's driving the outcomes that you are seeing or hoping to see. For example, you might hear from champions of your programming that they love it. They think it's the best. They want to tell all of their friends about it. But then when you systematically review the data, when you have data from more people and not just sort of the anecdotes of really enthusiastic participants, you may find that many people are actually struggling with implementation, which prevents the downstream impacts that you're hoping to have. A good data strategy surfaces what's actually having an impact and helps organizations make decisions based on really solid, accurate information.
Where is that balance between a good story that
Mm.
tends to be compelling, human
Mhm.
nature, it's good to raise some funds on, and the data to back it up.
To blend. So I think there is real power in testimonials, as you alluded to. And I think they're an important part of data storytelling. They can really exemplify a point that you may be seeing in the quantitative numbers. But as I just mentioned, I think it's an incomplete picture, right? So I really like to combine the two. So, for example, can I um, generate a report about outcomes from a training where I have the quantitative information regarding pre-post changes in um, a knowledge that the training is working to address, and then pair that with some qualitative feedback about how the training unlocked something that a participant previously wasn't aware of. I think that's most powerful.
So if you had a company that tends to be, or an organization that needs data,
Hmm.
which we all do, of course, if you're making decisions,
Yeah.
but tend to go either on collecting it from one type of source or going
Hmm.
more with a story, what advice would you give of why, and then even how to get started um, with more accurate data?
Yeah. So I would say it's really beneficial to proactively think about a comprehensive data strategy in those situations. And to start, I always advocate for beginning by looking at your theory of change. And if your organization doesn't have one or it's really out of date, making sure that that uh, is accurate. I think the theory of change should be the foundation for all of the other parts of the data strategy. You want everything to tie into that theory of change. So, having agreement among your key players in your organization that the theory of change is accurate, that it represents the mechanisms through which your organization is having impact is essential. Once you have that in place and up to date and you feel good about it, you can begin mapping each step of the theory of change to the outputs and outcomes that you would expect that step to produce. Then you can start identifying data sources that help you gather information about each of those outputs and outcomes, and thinking about the reports that your organization is going to need to make decisions. And you kind of need to think about these things all at the same time, which is a lot to hold in mind. And I personally advocate for a blend of data sources. So, can you leverage your administrative records? Can you pull in some publicly available data? Surveys, like we talked about, website analytics, focus groups. I think that really creates a rich, comprehensive picture of programming impact, and also, again, important for reducing the burden that's being placed on program recipients to provide data. I find Gugerty and Carlin's CART principles, so credible, actionable, responsible, and transportable for data collection, really helpful to think about here. Um, there should always be a clear plan to use the information you collect. For example, this survey item is going to be used in this report that we review on a monthly basis to determine allocation of staff, in order to really be responsible with the data that you are asking people to provide you with.
So, to be honest, theory of change is the first time I've ever heard that term.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I don't know if I've been out to lunch, but if you would explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a theory of change is a description of how you anticipate an impact is realized, right? For example, I'll talk about the organization I'm currently at, which is Trails, which is a school based mental health nonprofit, right? So, by equipping staff in school with evidence based practices that support mental health, then students in schools will have access to evidence based mental health practices, learning coping skills that set them up to succeed in life. And then, because they have that over the long term, we anticipate students will have lower levels of anxiety and depression. They'll have better academic outcomes. They will have long-term higher economic outcomes. Basically, like, it explains how you think your organization is having impact, like in a step-by-step kind of scientific manner. It's helpful for unpacking sort of when you don't see impact, why are you not seeing impact? It's a really helpful tool.
If there's an organization that knows they need better data, but they don't have the people or even know where to start, what advice would you give them?
Great question. So I would absolutely consider leveraging an evaluation research or evaluation consultant. There are a lot of independent research and evaluation practitioners who would be well positioned to help an organization review, update, think through a theory of change, think about the outcomes and outputs that map on to the steps of their theory of change, how to get that information. So I would really encourage an organization to start there. Additionally, for folks who are looking for more training in this, they want to be doing the work themselves for their organization. Northwestern University's Kellogg School has some great training for nonprofit executives. The course I took was Nonprofit Data Analytics and Impact, and that was a great foundation in data strategy that is really rooted in practical, immediately useful information to drive your organization's impact. And then last but not least, there's real value in having an in-house data team, right? If you need to do this work and you need to do it quickly and you know that you're going to need to have this capacity for a long time, it could be strategic to invest in that data infrastructure. I also think data can be a nice strategic differentiator for an organization. Organizations with strong data practices that can talk about how they are looking at the data in real time to continuously improve services. That's a huge win.
So it takes a lot of work to get the data
Mhm.
and to even come up with the plan, but the end result has so much more value than just not taking it. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think the information is higher quality, right? If you're thoughtful proactively about how you're blending sources and their relative strengths and weaknesses and being really strategic about that. So I do think it's higher quality. You go into decision making with more confidence, less second guessing, which frees up mental space, which I think, as you were talking about at the start of the podcast, right, is at a huge premium for nonprofit executives. The other thing is that it's just more responsible data collection. So without a clear direction for where you're trying to go, what you're trying to understand about your programming, how you'll use that information, it can be really easy to collect a lot of information from people because we all have things that we're curious about, right? And so if you say to an organization, what are the things you want to understand? You get dozens of ideas, right? And so you could be potentially asking people for a lot of their time, right, to give you answers on surveys. If you don't have a clear plan for that data and it just sits there, it doesn't benefit the community that they're coming from, right? Because it's not being used in reality for decision making and just not respectful of their time. You get better quality data, you're a better data steward, and also being more respectful of the communities that you're aiming to serve.
I want to emphasize that. When I was at the area level
Mhm.
serving Central Asia, the global operations person would say, "Kay, can you give me 10 minutes of your time and give me this information?" What he didn't realize is that was 30 hours of my time because it wasn't in a database or whatever else. So I
Mhm.
could collect it, but it was a very painful thing. And then I never received any benefit from
Right.
passing that knowledge on.
Right. That's such a frustrating position to be in. I've definitely been on the receiving end of those requests that are like, why can't you just spin this up in 5 minutes? Also, to not hear anything back. I think at a minimum, being transparent about we took this information, this is the decision that we made from it, or this is the information we've gathered from your community. Here's what we learned in a publication or, even a flyer or one pager that you can share back is really important.
So that wouldn't take tons of time to do, but it's finishing up that loop. It's saying,
Mhm.
thank you for the information, and we actually did something with it.
Absolutely. The We All Count data equity framework has a question about what is your data relationship, right? Are you asking people to be data donors where they are just giving you data and you're not providing anything back to them? Or are you in like true data partnership where they may be helping you to design questions, or the community may be weighing in on what outcomes are important to them. And you're incorporating that into your data strategy and then developing reporting that is meaningful to them as well. So I really think about that often. What is the type of relationship with the community this data strategy is facilitating or not facilitating?
So true. So I feel like this ties back into the original premise. I want to bring that back up
Yeah.
and have you just talk on it. That concept of who is this working for and
Hmm.
who is it not?
Right.
What does your gut say as why that is an important comment?
Oh, I mean, I think it's essential, right? There's a tendency to focus on sort of the overall average impact, right? So even when you think about a randomized control trial, which is considered the gold standard of impact evidence, what that's really telling you is like on average, is the treatment group having a different outcome than the control group? But within those groups, there could be so much variation. And I think there's a lot to be learned about how your programming is working by unpacking that variation. And I also think just ethically, saying, yep, on average, this is having impact, not good enough for me, frankly. Um, I want to understand whether there are segments of the community that's being served that aren't benefiting from the program or may even have, unintended adverse outcomes. And that goes back to the work that I did during my graduate program, where I heard firsthand about how policies that were probably written with good intentions were making life really hard for certain families who maybe didn't look like the families that the policy was intended for. There's ethical and like programmatic reasons why it's really important to understand who your programming is working for. Um, I'm happy to go on with an example about that.
Yeah, I'd be curious because it
Yeah.
does make sense. Like if you're not the average, you might be lost.
Right, right. And I can just do like a really personal example and then I can talk about a programmatic example. So I grew up with a single father, and a lot of the programming that was made for young girls in my area was really focused on the mother daughter relationship, right? And so that's a super well intended offering that the community has provided. And I was totally excluded because I didn't have a maternal figure in my family that could take me, right? And so I was someone for whom that programming was not working. And if anything, made me feel more isolated than I
Mhm.
had before. And just a small example, right? But to have an example from my professional experience, you can on the overall level, it may look like your programming is not having the impact that you would hope, and that can be really discouraging. And an organization can sit with that and have a lot of existential questions about what are we doing. But in my experience, when you unpack that sort of top level finding, there's a lot of variation under the hood. So, in one particular example, we figured out that implementation was varying tremendously across sites. And not shockingly, that implementation variation was driving differences in impact that we were observing. So, in places where implementation was really successful, we saw good outcomes. And where implementation was struggling, we didn't see a lot of change. And so, that point is a lot more actionable for organizations and a lot more interesting than sort of settling for that top line finding. They're both important, but that deeper understanding about how essential the implementation is then led us to think about how can we work with sites to address some of these implementation barriers and make implementation more possible, which then ultimately drives higher impact, right? If you're addressing some of those implementation challenges.
So the interesting thing is, I could see data become an intellectual pursuit. But what
Hmm.
I'm hearing you say is it's not an intellectual pursuit. It really is to make change in action.
Right. I think research and evaluation can be thought of as this like very academic, intellectual exercise, but I personally view it as a strategic asset for an organization to be able to continuously monitor what is happening with your programming and the impact that it's having. Allows you to be proactive about places where you're not seeing what you had hoped, which then in turn allows you to have the most impact possible on the communities that you're hoping to serve.
So, how do you take data, which
Mhm.
can be analytical, mathy,
Mhm.
nerdy, and turn it into and turn it into human story, or connecting it back
Mhm.
to the people it's serving?
I think that's such an important skill to engage with because it's great to have a data team. It's great to have a leadership team that values being data driven, but the real value starts to be realized when you have an organization where like all of the staff appreciate the value that data can bring and like want to understand the data for their part of the program. And that isn't natural, I think, particularly for folks who view research and evaluation as more like quanty, mathy, as you were saying. And so I think being able to make that information useful to folks across the organization is really essential. I have done that in a couple of ways. So, one, I think, is creating some almost like professional development resources for staff on your team that may have less experience with data than you. So, finding great trainings, or even I've written supporting documentation for staff that are interfacing with sites more directly than I am. For example, about how to think about a small sample size and how to have a conversation with a site, given that their data may not be based on a ton of responses from folks. So that sort of supportive documentation, helping to build sort of shared language and understanding around data. I think there's also a component of really making the data useful to other folks. So, what do they need to understand about what's happening in order to do their job well? And can you build that into your data strategy? Can you make sure that there is a report, not only for leadership, right, but reports that feed back to your site coordinators or your project managers that provide them with that need to know information to do their jobs better? Often staff can be asked to help support data collection, but sort of going back to that theme of not really getting or ever hearing back really, except maybe you hear a top line finding and in all staff, right? Like, how do you make the data actionable to folks who sit in very different spaces in the organization? Um, I think also providing just like one-to-one personal support with thinking about the data. I host a lot of office hours, and folks will come with questions that they have, and I have found those conversations really engaging. So, one example, we had two satisfaction metrics that were sort of pointing in opposite directions for one program. And the program director came to me, was like really perplexed by this, wanted my help to understand why these things would kind of say different messages about her programming. And so we walked through what are the questions, what are the response options. So in this particular case, there were two satisfaction questions. One was a net promoter score where you have to rate your experience on a, 0 out of 10. And another one was a general sort of generally, how satisfied are you? Not at all satisfied to very satisfied. And so we talked through how there could be people who would rate their experience a 6 out of 10 because, like, they're satisfied, but they're not enthusiastic people. They could rate a 6 on the net promoter, which would get them categorized as a detractor. And they could also respond satisfied to a general question about satisfaction. So they would contribute to like the percent satisfied or very satisfied in one metric, and at the same time contribute to the detractor score and another. So talking through that, I provided an example of my dad, who's definitely that person who's like just satisfied with everything, was really helpful for her. And we came away from that with a lot of ideas. So she had specific ideas about moving some folks from neutral to promoter category, and I came away with some hypotheses to really dig into to understand those different subgroups of program participants. So I think it's mutually beneficial to engage in and bringing other folks alongside you in that work.
I think that's a really important point if you're an organization that has multi-cultures.
Mm-hmm.
My boss was British, and
Mm.
so when we would always do the, from 1 to 10, and he goes, "And for you Americans, it's, 5 to 7," or whatever, like, he
Right.
nailed it, right? His scale as a Brit was a different scale than our scale as an American from a general point of view, and I'm like, "Yeah, but, like, do you have anything to say on that in light of culture and data?"
I think that's fascinating. As someone who spent a couple of years living in London as a kid, that does not surprise me. I'll start there. I think for me, that just really underscores the importance of collaboration, both with the communities being served, but also within your organization on the data strategy work. Setting the questions that you are seeking to understand, even co interpreting the results you see together can be invaluable, both for the most rich understanding possible for organization leadership, but also, again, making that data valuable and meaningful to communities that are giving their time to provide that data. Those benefits are just amplified when you have a multicultural context.
Yeah, I love that idea of having more eyes on it in light of the interpreting of it. So before we close up, I just want to know a year from now, where do you want to be? What are some goals that you have related to this in this coming year?
It's a great question. So I would say, I would like to be helping a mission driven organization by leading their data strategy, helping them grow their impact and also improve upon the ways in which they're using data to drive that impact at an organization that views data as a strategic asset and not a reporting obligation. I'm also looking currently for ways in which I can use my research and evaluation skills to give back to organizations. So also thinking about ways to engage in either some pro bono consulting or board membership work.
Tyler, I've seen a lot of quality stuff you've done, but we also want to learn from what you would have maybe wanted to do differently. Is there an example of mistakes you've made that would be really helpful for us to know?
For sure. So I would say the biggest lesson I've learned in my career is that being diplomatic at times has cost me and the organizations I've worked with more than it saved. I've spent years optimizing processes that I probably should have just questioned more strongly from the start. At different times and in different organizations, I've been asked to improve upon an existing data strategy or existing data function when I should have pushed harder to rebuild. In hindsight, I wish I had leaned more into the expertise that I was bringing into the situation as a research and evaluation professional, as opposed to, I think, what was probably too deeply honoring the existing systems. And it would have been more efficient organizationally. We would have been better data stewards had I really insisted on that reboot earlier. I'm wondering if you've seen that tension between sort of being a team player and playing the role of the expert that you've been hired to be, come up with other guests or in your work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting piece, in particular being a woman,
Hmm.
right? Where there's something that's really important and you're an odd bird out, right? Because you hold a type of knowledge that isn't the normal way of thinking. Leaders tend to be visionary, maybe don't really care about details. And then you're coming in with a wait, we need to reset. So there is a tension there. Cause like my first thought as you were talking is, what held you back? So I'd love for you to answer that yourself, but I do think there's some lessons that really are
Hmm.
important.
Yeah, I think in terms of what held me back, right, I think there was pressure in various situations from leaders who were maybe more visionary, right? They want to go, go, go. They don't want to sort of stop, really think about things again from the beginning when they felt like, well, this has already been thought about. I think I could have done a better job sort of managing up about the benefits of a really uh, streamlined, intentional data strategy, how it would not only benefit people we were asking for data from in terms of less being asked of them, but also our staff, right? Collecting a bunch of data that you don't use is a tremendous administrative burden on an organization. Even the energy to store that data that you're not using, right? So I think I should have, in retrospect, managed up around the organization benefit. And that's been, I think, part of my learning coming from an academic background, right? Really how to make a case that's not only about data quality, but that's also about organization operation. So I think those are probably some of the biggest barriers. And also, it's hard when you're new to an organization. At least for me, it's easy for me to think there's something I'm just not seeing about this.
Yeah.
And I am working on addressing that a little bit.
That would be a great training,
Mm,
especially for those who hold this kind of data, financial leadership data. How do you lead up? And how do you
yes.
make your voice heard? How do you deal with visionaries, leaders who, yeah, kind of swat away details, and whole loop around of how to communicate back to those who have given you the data?
Hmm.
So maybe we need to work on that together. It is really important. I've seen it a lot. I was an operations leader,
Hmm.
and operations also, I'm a visionary leader, but mitigate risk. That's what
Right.
operations does, right? I was the one championing data,
Hmm.
and he hated data. So he knew I was always going to champion it no matter what. And so since he
Mm.
didn't want it, but it was the concept of, if this is what you're champion and I don't like it, then I'm just gonna pass it on. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, but the important thing was, it kind of went to your point, is the data is important enough that we do need to stand up for it, but do it in such a way that you will be heard and
Hmm.
that you can lead up. There's a lot to unpack there. But it's important. So
Yeah.
thank you for what you do, and like the expertise you have, and how you take data and make it into a human approach to making things better because of the data.
Thank you so much, Marla. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast. And thank you for creating a space for nonprofit leaders to learn from each other because there's a lot of wisdom available for our collective benefit.
Thank you so much. And you have a lovely rest of your day, and
Thank you,
look
too.
forward to future conversations. Thank you for listening. And until next time, lead your team with clarity, with confidence, and take care of yourself.